Hello, and welcome to What is Innovation? The podcast that explores the reality of a word that is in danger of losing its meaning altogether. This podcast is produced by Outlast Consulting, LLC, a boutique consultancy that helps companies use innovation principles to solve their toughest business problems. I'm your host, Jared Simmons, and I'm so excited to have Monique Childress. Monique Childress is the founder and principal of Horizon Advisory Group in Atlanta, Georgia, which provides organizational strategy services for purpose-driven organizations committed to supporting and improving the lives of underrepresented communities. Horizon's mission is to help these organization leaders to define the path to their next horizon through strategic planning, organizational development, and facilitated stakeholder collaboration. She possesses 10 years' experience in organizational strategy, planning, and consulting for nonprofits, small businesses, and Fortune 500 corporations. Prior to Horizon, she held leadership roles in management leadership for Tomorrow's advisory practice and Accenture's talent and organization strategy practice, where she worked with client executive and senior leadership teams on large-scale human capital strategy and transformation efforts. A Chicago native, Monique holds a BSBA from Washington University in St. Louis and an MBA from the University of Michigan. She has also completed additional professional training in human-centered design with Luma Institute, design sprints with AJ and Smart, and advanced facilitation training on presencing race, gender, and collective healing, and diversity in the workplace through the University of South Florida. In her spare time, Monique teaches yoga, volunteers as treasurer for the Atlanta Unbound Academy's board of directors, and she is a mentor with Emory University's Start Me business training program. Monique, thank you so much for agreeing to join us on the show today. I'm so excited for our conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to it as well.
Yeah. All right. Why don't we just dive in then? Tell me, what is innovation?
Innovation is when curiosity is realized in a way that introduces something new, a new way of thinking, a new way of working, a new way to solve a problem.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about curiosity, what does curiosity mean to you?
Yeah, when I think about curiosity, there's a few ways of looking at it. It could be, daring to consistently ask why when you hear this is how it's always done. It can arise when you have data that signals a need to change. So data from feedback or revenue, retention, participation, different types of data. And once you get that signal, you need to take the steps to change. When there's a new idea that's brought to you and you ask questions and you may explore it or test it. And then sometimes there's no signal to change, but there's a desire to just serve your audience better. Mm-hmm. And so that curiosity will lead you to explore it.
I see. So the curiosity is sort of a driver for exploration.
Yeah. And then realizing that curiosity, that's when we get into... If the curiosity is the mindset, then the realization is the capability and the capacity to act on that curiosity.
Got it. Oh, there's a lot there. That's a really great way of thinking about it. And, I can imagine a breakdown could be where the curiosity isn't connected to capability in the right way, or there isn't the capability to kind of take advantage of what you learn through being curious.
Yeah, because curiosity is really the trigger for just thinking about pursuing something new or even getting an idea to think about something in a new way. But when I think about the capability, that's where we're thinking about, if we're thinking about from an individual or organization perspective, are the skills that are needed, are they there? Do you have the right tools? Do you have the right resources, the processes in place? That's where I think about the capability. And then you also need the capacity to do it, right? You need the time for the amount of effort that it would take. You need dedicated roles to take on those responsibilities. So it has to be more than curiosity to really start the actions in motion. And then that's when you really get to the innovation.
Got it. So curiosity is just kind of like the instigator, the sort of spark.
Yes, the spark.
Got it. I like that a lot because it does kind of point to the fact that you need some fuel to be able to actually reach impact, to move forward in innovation. In your description, sounds like it's the capability and the capacity to actually take advantage of the spark.
Yeah, I like what you say is, the curiosity is the fuel, and then that capability and capacity, that really just being the engine.
How does this come to life as you work with your clients? I know you work a lot in the nonprofit sector. You have a background in the for-profit world as well. How have you seen some of these things come to life?
Well, like I said, there's different ways that curiosity can come about. And
Hmm.
so for an organization that's working deep in the community, providing direct services, maybe they're just starting to get some feedback from the community members or from their partners about something that's either not quite working or just something more programming or different programming that they want to see. And there are some organizations that can take that feedback and actually try to turn it into something actionable. And then there's other organizations where they'll get the feedback, but that's really just where the conversation stops.
Mm,
And so it's really about, there's the phrase, you know better, you do better.
right.
But I think for organizations and in the work that I do with strategic planning, a lot of that initial work is just understanding like, what do we know? What do we need to know? That might give us some clues on some actions to take moving forward. So we're curious about what's out there, even if there's no initial spark, whether
Hmm.
from that feedback. And then for like for profit, that could come into play by, okay, our revenues are down, profits are down. Just taking that same type of data and doing some exploration to see why and what opportunities might come up there.
I see. So it sounds like there are companies that could hear the same thing, get the same type of feedback from a stakeholder, whether, it's a shareholder or a customer or a constituent or, someone who's benefiting from service. Two companies could hear the same thing, but not necessarily be sparked into action in the same way.
Absolutely. And so I would say that the one that actually does take the action, they would be the more innovative of the two.
Hmm. Hmm. And how does that get started? So if I'm a company or a nonprofit organization and I'm hearing things, what's the difference between sort of hearing it and listening? Or, you and I talked a bit before we were on about listening and
Hmm.
the energy it takes. How do you help someone think about, okay, well, I must be getting some feedback that I'm not hearing. So how do you go about doing a better job of listening to that?
So this is where we get into the capability of the organization to listen, but also to analyze and to evaluate. And so for many nonprofit organizations, when it comes to their programming, there's an element of data reporting or evaluation that can vary in terms of like the level of detail, but that's a real opportunity to capture that feedback, but also analyze the feedback and start to apply it. And for the organizations that may be smaller and just not really have the time or the skill sets available to really analyze that data, they may either not know what to do with it or they know that they could do something, but they're just so under resourced
Hmm.
that they can't act on it. I think that's really where that capability and capacity building is really critical for nonprofit organizations to make space for innovation to occur.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that a lot. And I can imagine if you spend a lot of time in a capability and capacity constrained mode, you might stop listening. You might get less curious because you feel like you don't necessarily have the ability to act on anything you learn or hear anyway.
Absolutely. You get overwhelmed.
Hmm.
There's too much data and there's not an easy way to analyze it. And so you just ignore it or you just sit it to the side or, maybe you just take what you need versus what the data is actually just telling you.
Right, right. One of the things you're particularly good at is, kind of taking feedback like interview responses and things and turning that into insights. Why is it important for someone to be able to take what people are saying? A lot of times you talk about innovation in the context of the data, but I think it's also important to be able to have a conversation with someone or have someone make a comment and then take that from just what they said to kind of the insight that could move toward innovation. How do you go about doing that?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, being able to really pull those insights out, I think one, that's where it's beneficial to have an outside consultant come in
Hmm.
to really help you to capture that data because we're listening for what's being said and what's not being said. We're making connections in our head as the interviews are going on with other interviews or conversations that we've had with the organization. And really, before the interviews even start, is working with the organization to understand, okay, what do you already know, or what do you already think you know about your stakeholders? What would you want to know from them that maybe you just haven't had an opportunity to ask?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they haven't offered it up, or maybe they have responded to a survey in the past or something, but you weren't in the space to really take that information. So here's an opportunity to really ask again and get context and ask those follow-up questions based on what the goals are for the insight. So for some clients, it's just the insights gathering engagement.
Mm-hmm.
We just want to do like a voice of the audience. But for others, that might be just the first step in a strategic planning process, or maybe we're looking at their operating model and making some changes there.
Right.
We're looking to make some changes. We're looking to set goals, but we want to first know where we're starting.
Sure. Have you been involved in processes like this where that first step, which I think is super important, where that first step is not necessarily done in a quality way? So what's the risk if you don't spend the right amount of time and effort on the front end listening?
Yeah, I've seen it where the sources of the data, so the people that are identified for interviews, or just the types of people, it's really missing. It's not telling the full story.
Right.
So maybe we're only talking to partners where you have a really great relationship with, but there might be some other partners that maybe have fallen by the wayside, and they are rooting for your organization from the sidelines, but their relationship just needs a bit of repair. That would be a great source to talk to. As long as the bridge isn't burned, if they're open to talking, they clearly understand what challenges are lying ahead for the client. They understand what may have gotten in the way before for a solid relationship. And they're thinking about what they would need to see to move forward and maybe reestablish that relationship. Other times, it's not really getting the voice of the community. So I mentioned working with nonprofit organizations is almost equivalent to a for-profit organization not talking to their customers to see what their customers want, how the customers experience the organization. Well, with the nonprofit organization, let's talk to the community. Let's see,
Right.
What's the perception of the community? Is there trust? What type of programming do they need? What type of support do they need? How do they feel engaged and heard from the organization? What more do they need to see from the organization to increase their trust and support, and really be one of the vocal supporters across the community to continue to build that base? I've seen that more often than I would like to see, of not getting that connection to the community to get their voices in.
It's so important. And it's such a great analogy. I think anyone would agree that it would be ridiculous for a for-profit company not to talk to their customers. But somehow, when it gets translated into the nonprofit world, it doesn't seem as self-evident that you should be talking to the community and to your constituents. I think sometimes the passion gets in the way, because nonprofit leaders are often passionate about the mission of the organization. And sometimes that passion leads you to believe that you already know because you have a point of view, or maybe you've experienced what the problem that you're trying to solve with the organization. But that doesn't mean that yours is the only point of view on that problem. But I think it can kind of feel like that when you're passionate and, I was in this situation and I know what it feels like. I think sometimes leads to people not necessarily engaging folks the way that they could.
I think that's a really good point, assuming that your experience, not just as a leader, but as an individual, would be the same for the communities that you're serving, especially if there's some overlap with circumstances or demographics. But I think also when you talk about that passion-led leadership, that's one way to really keep your staff engaged, as everyone is very passionate, very purpose-driven. But it also gets into the conversation, and some nonprofit leaders don't really like when they hear it, but nonprofit is just a tax status. It's still a business, right. But they don't operate like a business because they just want to do what's right for the community. They want to just provide those services. And so not really thinking about it strategically as a business,
Right.
that sometimes also gets in the way of why we're not thinking about talking to the community. One last thing that I'll add is just not seeking the community because you assume that you already know what their experiences are. And then there's not thinking about the nonprofit as a business to run. But then there's also conflicting stakeholders. One of the reasons why, like we mentioned, if you were to go get the voice of the customer for a business, a for-profit business, that would make sense because the customer is the one that's spending the money.
Right.
Whereas with the nonprofit organization, if they're heavily funded by foundations, then the community, to kind of compare it to a startup, the community would be the users, but they're not the customers. And so you spend time talking to those that are doling out the funds, which would be the donors, the sponsors, the foundations, and those, they don't always have an understanding of the needs of the community.
Oh, I couldn't agree with that more. It's a very unique challenge within the nonprofit space. I agree with what you said. And my only build on that is it also, I think, affects your operational strategy sometimes because it can feel like raising more money or landing a new donor or getting a new grant from a new foundation can feel like work and impact. And it's great and it's necessary, but it's not impact. It's resources, it's fuel to then turn into impact into the community. But going out to raise a bunch of money or win grants and things like that can sometimes consume an organization to the point that you forget, let alone talking to the community, but it almost becomes sort of a secondary thing to actually go out and do the work.
Yeah, like the grants and the funding, that's the means to an end.
Exactly.
But the end is the mission.
Exactly.
It's not the funding.
Exactly. And it's really tough because there's a lot of prestige. And people always say, oh, well, nonprofits are about passion and led by passionate people. And, there's a lot of ego in the for-profit world. There's a lot of ego in the nonprofit world, too. It's not necessarily evil. All ego isn't evil, but it's hard to overcome ego. So, if it makes you proud to say you've raised $1 million or you've now are funded by the so-and-so foundation, that's ego. Now you're going to turn that money into impact in the community, but it can be a distraction and can lead to a slowdown in innovation and a slowdown in the basic operations of the organization if you take your eye off of that piece.
Yeah. And I think another place where I see ego come into play is where you have the organizations that are still being led by those that founded the organization.
Yes.
So similar to a startup and a startup founder, it's, I've identified a problem and I've identified the solution. And for a nonprofit, it's through programming.
Right.
And this is the way that we'll work on this problem. And when there's other ideas that may come into play or the circumstances around the problem shift, that's where ego can come into play around, you have board members that may want to go in a different direction. You have staff members that may be questioning the decisions that are made. And then for some founders, they're able to take the information like we talked about earlier, take that information and do something with it. And then for others, it could turn defensive very quickly. How a founder responds to that feedback, it's not necessarily criticism, but it could just be suggestions or questions from people who are as passionate, as the founder about whatever issue that they're working towards. They can get really defensive, and that could really be a make or break moment for those organizations in terms of survival and sustainability.
So true. So true. At some point, the organization has to outgrow the founder to become a separate entity in and of itself.
Yeah, unless you achieve your vision.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you can sunset the organization. Job well done. Let's work on the next thing.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. Terms like ego and politics, people tend to reserve for the for-profit world, but it's important to acknowledge that those things exist in the nonprofit world or they won't get addressed. And, this isn't criticism of the nonprofit space. It's just an acknowledgement that human beings organized where more than one human being, is involved in trying to accomplish something, there will be politics and there will be egos. Mm-hmm. The great thing about the nonprofit world is that those things you encounter those things in the pursuit of something positive for the world, but they're still there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're there for any type of organization.
Yeah, exactly. Do you have an approach that you like to use to getting strategic planning sort of off the ground? I know sometimes it's hard to get nonprofits out of that sort of mission vision conversation and into, okay, what are the things we're going to go do and what are we not going to go do?
Yeah, it's interesting. With most of the clients, do some sort of leadership style, communication style assessment. And that's usually if it's, I'm coming in to do some sort of team building or a staff retreat or something like that. But where I found it helpful, either before we get into strategic planning or at the very beginning, is we can start to have the conversation about, okay, based on how our leadership styles play out across this team or the organization, how is this going to show up with strategic planning and that process? And where is it going to help and where is it going to hurt? So if we are very consensus building, we're big picture thinking, we like to throw out ideas, we like to make sure that everyone is on the same page and we're motivating and influential in our speech, then the mission, vision, values, there's going to be very high energy, very high participation when we're starting that. And that is the basis and the foundation for the plan, for the organizations that I work with. Even if there is an established mission, vision, values for the organization, we'll still at least spend a little time to take a look to see, is it still valid? Does it need to be updated? And we'll take a look at that after I share the insights from the data gathering process. Mm-hmm. So whether I did a survey or some focus groups or some interviews, a community listening session, what have you, is taking these insights and saying, okay, given these insights and then your experience with the organization, is this something we need to take a look at? And so I know that those sessions are going to go really well.
Right.
But if they're really strong in that consensus building, that big picture thinking, that, rah communication style,
sure,
then they're probably light on tactical decision making, paying attention to details, asking why. Mm-hmm. And that is where strategic planning really shifts from establishing who we are and where we're headed to how we're going to get there. And I've started to just let them know up front, hey, here's what I'm kind of seeing in terms of the style of the organization. So as the facilitator for this process, I'll just keep that in mind. And I know that my project management needs to intensify around that time because I'm going to lose the energy. We're going to lose that momentum.
Right.
So that's something in terms of how I kind of approach it of getting beyond the exciting parts of the strategic plan, because when we talk about the example you gave about development and raising X amount of money, mm-hmm. That's part of what will help us to do what we do. But really, when we get into the execution of the plan and how we're going to achieve these goals, this is really where the true impact happens. Mm-hmm. And so it's keeping the clients, and this is, from the staff to the management team, the leadership team, the board members, keeping everyone aware of why we're really here.
Right.
We're here to make impact. We're here to achieve the mission, achieve the vision. So we've said it, in the fun part of the conversation. So now let's actually do it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I love that approach, and particularly appreciate the way you laid it out in terms of shifting from facilitator to project manager and having both those skill sets to choose from. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of times when you're facilitating, you're managing energy. And then in the project management mode, you might have to bring the energy and provide the push to keep things moving. And if you don't have both skill sets, it's easy to get stuck in one or the other, and also to sort of end up riding waves with the client instead of being that steadying sort of force that keeps progress moving, whether there's intrinsic energy or not. The other thing that came to mind when you were describing, the different kinds of leaders and where their strengths might be and where their energy might naturally lie is I found that they tend to, the leaders who, are energized by that mission, vision, value element of it are sometimes intentionally, but what they think are good reasons, exclusionary of people who are more tactical and less energized by the more conceptual aspect of things. And, people will say things like, oh, well, we don't need him in this meeting. We'll pull him in once we've figured out what we want to do. Things like that. And for me, that's always a challenge to manage, because the more you manufacture the audience, the less diversity you have. Mm-hmm. And the conversation suffers. The conversation may be smoother and nicer and more fun with less diversity in the room, but it's not going to be as rich, and it's not going to lead to the same kinds of outcomes.
And that's where you get into, this is what we've always done.
Yep.
Yeah, the conversations will be smoother, but we're here to chart a new path, or we're here to make a change. And you can't make a change having the same types of conversations that you've had before. Mm-hmm. If I think about like the guiding principles that I really use to facilitate a strategic planning process, and when I tell clients, one of the main ones is that the process of strategic planning is more important than the plan itself, the actual like output. Because the plan is a moment in time. It's what we plan to do from today. So if we had a plan that said starting March 1st, 2020, this is what we're going to do for the next 3 years, then by March 7th, that plan does not matter, because that's when the world, shuts down. Yeah, exactly. But the process of the plan is more important, because that's where you're building the muscle to think strategically and to delegate and to facilitate on your own as an organization without the consultant there. So if through the process, if you notice that some voices aren't being heard, or they're not being as encouraged to participate, that is a prime opportunity as the third party to bring them into the conversations and to allow them to add the value that they can add, but also really watch out for the progress of the conversation, so that this person isn't trying to derail progress or the conversation just to do it. But for them to get on board, they just need more understanding. They need more details.
Right.
So if we know that this person is going to ask a lot of questions because they need more details, then how can we provide the details up front? Or how can we bring someone else in who understands how to provide the details, right, and kind of do that translation? That's always my goal of this like co-created, co-collaborative process, is to get everyone talking and understanding. And that's why it's helpful to start off talking about the different types of styles that might be in the room, because it's not a criticism on one type of style. It's just showing that these are the ways that we might have to communicate with each other that are not our natural inclinations, but it's what the other person needs to hear so you can get what you need done.
Right. Exactly. And you're going to have to slow down or have a suboptimal conversation to be able to engage and capture that, that value from that person.
Right. You want to be intentional and efficient with the time that you have together. You're wasting time if you're not.
Exactly. That's so true. And I wonder if you've noticed this as well, where, okay, you have that high level conversation, and then the conceptual thinkers think, okay, well, that's done. Now go call Bob and whomever else and Jane and, the detail folks, and they'll figure it out from here, And that sort of handoff mindset is also, I think, a byproduct of that same dynamic you're describing. But there's value in having detail-oriented people in the big picture conversations, and there's value in having big picture conceptual thinkers in the execution phase. The diversity of thought is beneficial in both modes, but I find that especially when people are more senior and conceptual thinkers, they take the opportunity to kind of step away once they think the quote unquote, big picture work is done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, on the flip side, I've worked with a number of teams where everyone is so bogged down in the day-to-day
Yes.
that all they can think about is execution.
Yes.
And they can't really think beyond this week or this month. And
Yep.
so that's where you do need that big picture thinker, that visionary, that influencer. You do need them as part of the conversation to kind of slow down the conversation of getting into execution too quickly.
Right.
But once it is time to get into execution, they're the ones that's like connecting the dots around why we're doing it.
Yes. Yes.
So, yes, this is how we're going to get it done, but we got to connect it back to what our goals are, like for this process and over the next few years. And is this the right path to get there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We can't get so busy, chopping down the one tree that we don't look up to realize that we're in the wrong forest.
Which I will say, with the work of many nonprofit organizations, especially those that are providing direct services, it's easier said than done.
Oh, for sure.
Especially given the last 2 years. But it is something, and this is where we go back to, like, you have to have the capacity to make space for conversations around innovation and what are we going to try this new, or what do we want to explore. You really have to just make that time, and you have to build it into the ways that you're working so that you can still get the day-to-day done. That does require a lot of attention, but not lose sight of, as a leadership team, we also need to continue to keep our eyes a few years ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a delicate balance. And, the benefit of working with an external third-party consultant like you, through that process is you're able to help to see those things, from an objective distance, and help organizations operate more efficiently and effectively through that process and find things they wouldn't otherwise see, get things done more efficiently than they otherwise would. I know a lot of times it can be tough, consulting in the nonprofit world, because people have such a scarcity mindset. A lot of leaders can have such a scarcity mindset, but that third party view is just, it unlocks so much more impact for the community when it's done well.
Yeah, I think that scarcity versus abundance mindset, that is something that I've been fortunate enough to have a few client leaders that are actually really excited about abundance and leadership development and, all these, the different trends that are happening in leadership.
Right.
And they're sold, so they're just trying to get their leadership team and their management teams on board. But it is sort of seeing that first domino of just really understanding the leaders of not even the future, but the leaders of today, and what is really going to be most helpful to make the most significant impact for the communities that are being served. It's not the scarcity mindset.
Right. And I think also, something you brought up earlier about the past couple of years and, being in execution mode and just trying to keep up and all those things. I think it's important to think about third-party external support just from a preservation standpoint for your team. One more project or one more thing or one more, piece of work doesn't look like much, one at a time. But over the past couple of years, things have built up. And I think it's important to have some external support, even in the nonprofit world, to help manage burnout and manage their stress, and bring someone in who hasn't been dealing with all of this for the last 2 years and can look at it with fresh eyes.
Well, we've been dealing with our own things, but not in the
exactly. That's what I mean.
Yeah,
their problem. When we come to a new client, it's a new problem for us.
Right.
Yeah, so we have a slightly different, but you're right. Consultants have had their own. We've been dealing with our own for the last couple of years. You were right about that.
But yeah, I think it is just like fresh eyes to their situations. And I think two things that the external consultant can provide. One is perspective. This isn't a problem specific to the organization. This is something that literally every client team is talking about and trying to figure out.
Yeah.
And so it's not that, so good luck, but really there's no right or wrong answer right now that releases the constraint, of getting something wrong. It's really like, now we could just try something and see what works.
Right.
So just bringing in that perspective.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think helps with having a third party like you said, around like managing the energy around it, is understanding the burnout, and people just don't want to have to do one more thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've tried to plan out the projects in a way that the time that I have with like the large groups for like working sessions or retreats throughout the process, that is the time that they need to commit. There's not pre-work, there's not work in between the sessions. Like that work, it'll be on the whoever the main client stakeholder, so maybe it's on the management team to really like continue to lead the process forward.
Sure.
But if we're doing a staff session, for example, all you need to do is show up.
Oh, right. If
you could show up and give us this time where there's like a half day, understand where the stakeholders are in their energy and in their capacity, whether it be the time on their schedule or just like the mental space that they have for it. And I found that to be really helpful.
So compartmentalizing and saying, hey, look, there's no hidden cost here, so to speak, from a time standpoint. I'm asking you for this time, and I will confine my ask of your time to this commitment.
Yeah, because the strategic planning process, it could take a while. There's, of course, some ways for smaller organizations, maybe they just take a weekend to really knock everything out. But for a comprehensive strategic planning process, you're looking at anywhere between like 5 and 9 months. Maybe shorter, maybe longer.
Right.
And so when people see that timeline, it's like, oh my goodness, we're going to be doing what for how long?
Yeah,
but that's the length of the engagement. It's not necessarily the amount of effort that's needed from each and every stakeholder.
Right.
And so that's where that project manager, facilitator, those two hats really play into each other. It's really the consultant's role to take the organization through that process while managing the different stakeholders that are participating and being upfront with the client around, these are the types of people that will need to help us make decisions. They need to be aware that we'll need X amount of time from them. And if they could commit to that, then they should be on this decision-making team.
Right.
If they can't commit to that, then they can be made aware. But that's really where you see some hurdles is we can't get on anyone's calendar to make decisions. And this is pre-pandemic or during the pandemic.
Exactly.
So you just have to be upfront with the client about what the expectations are so that we can just select the right folks to be part of the process, but also be inclusive of everyone and respectful of everyone's time.
Well said. Well said. I appreciate you kind of walking through that with people because I don't think we always have a full appreciation for how strategic planning works, like the actual nuts and bolts of how this actually happens. I think there's this viewpoint that you get some people in a room and put some Post-its on a wall and then that's it. But it's the day-to-day blocking and tackling of change management, relationship management, stakeholder management, clarifying decision rights and following the data and all those things behind the scenes that really make what you do so valuable to your clients.
Yeah, there's a lot of behind the scenes work. There's a lot of conversations so that once the plan is developed, everyone has had some type of role in it. It's not new. It's not a surprise.
Right.
And you mentioned like the decision rights. We already know for these 3 to 5 goals, who has responsibilities within those goals, who's accountable for them. And we can get started right away. Versus if you do have that. Now, I use sticky notes, but it's across multiple sessions. But if you do have that, like take one Saturday, take one weekend approach, it's really only those that are available to show up or those that were invited.
Yep.
Whatever comes out of that one session is then presented to everyone as this is the way forward. And there's probably questions about where this came from.
Yep.
Why wasn't I included?
Exactly.
Why don't we have something else? There's just a lot of questions that will come out of a process like that.
No doubt.
There's some organizations that are smaller, that are newer, that can't really bring on an external consultant at the time, or maybe this is just their first process and they need to get something down. So there is value in doing that sort of like shorter approach, that template-based approach.
Sure.
Like I said, when you're doing a comprehensive process, there's a lot of buy-in that needs to really occur
Yeah.
across the process to really make it successful. And this is why when we're talking about, I mentioned like the process is so much more important, but also I think valuable to the client than the actual deliverable itself.
Well said. Well said. And it makes such a difference in terms of innovation and the organization's ability to innovate. I mean, a strong strategic planning process gets you off on the right foot, allows you to make sure you have the capability and the capacity to actually execute on the mission, vision, and values that you've got for the organization. And the way you go about it, I think, is really powerful. And it's also something that the nonprofit space could use more of. One last question for you before I let you go. I want to know if you have any advice for innovators.
Yeah, so I think whether you're a consultant or a staff member, board member, leader, one big piece of advice is just to keep asking questions, keep maintaining that curiosity, and really just to, one, always make sure that everyone is clear about why we're doing what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You have the mission and the vision established, but if you think about the number of new staff members, new volunteers, new board members, new partners, a lot of opportunities that way to really think about and act on. Because like I said, innovation is really just about a new way of doing something.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just one big aha moment. It's not one new shiny piece of technology or anything like that, but it's really about understanding what our strengths are, what the opportunities are for us to explore and to lead, and how we can go about doing it. So just keep asking questions, keep talking to people to understand what the needs are for the populations that you're serving. So just keep talking.
Yeah, right. Keep the lines of communication open. That's well said. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and to share your thoughts. Innovation in the nonprofit space is a passion area of mine. And I know that the for-profit world gets a lot of the attention when you talk about innovation, but in terms of what people are accomplishing with limited resources and limited budget and small teams in the nonprofit world, the lessons to be learned about innovation from the nonprofit world are endless.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
So thank you so much for joining. And it was a pleasure as always. I always enjoy our conversations. Good to talk to you again, and looking forward to the next time.
Same here. Thank you for inviting me on the podcast. And also, I really enjoy our conversations and looking forward to just continuing to work with these nonprofit organizations as they try to innovate their way to impact.
Thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Take care. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this week's show. You can drop us a line on Twitter at Outlast LLC, OUTLAST LLC, or follow us on LinkedIn where we're Outlast Consulting. Until next time, keep innovating, whatever that means.